In today's video, we're going to be breaking down the fantastic Magic the Gathering strategy article, Mind Over Magic. It was written by Robert Hahn, one of the early Magic strategy writers way back in 1997, but while Magic has changed a lot since then, the mental side of the game has remained crucial, and these lessons are still very relevant to your games today. We're going to be going through the article, making sure that all the examples make sense to a modern context, and basically just sharing this fantastic piece of strategy with a modern audience because it is quite hard to find unless you know where to look. Without further ado, let's dive on in. Mind Over Magic by Robert Hahn. So it appeared in The Duelist, which was kind of the original Magic strategy publication in June 1997. Great minds. So what makes a great Magic player? The answers are as varied as the players themselves. Most are extremely good deck builders, but some great players never make their own deck. They just copy a successful deck and crush everyone within driving distance, because remember, you were only playing with paper cards back then. Most are aware of the subtle nuances of the rules, but there are some who would use a Thawing Glaciers before casting Armageddon. Thawing Glaciers is a card that lets you put extra lands into play, and Armageddon is a card that destroys all lands, not realizing that Armageddon would destroy both the glacier and the land it fetched. The one thing that is common among all great players is a strong inner game of Magic, a kind of mastery within themselves that translates into mastery of the playing field. The inner game is not simply the brute will to win. The desire to conquer often translates into the uglier sides of competition, appearing in the form of cheating, abusive behavior, rudeness, and arrogance. The inner game is a mastery over the self that comes from experience. If the goal of the outer game is to beat your opponent, the goal of the inner game is to understand and harness the power of self. The great players all compete with discipline and mastery over their emotions. Any player can win if he or she gets a great draw or if an opponent is mana hosed. It takes a great player to overcome a poor draw to claim victory. Within the playing community, there are many ways to describe various facets of this ability. The Jedi mind trick, the good player draw, or most often, luck. What is seldom recognized is that good players seem to get lucky more often because of their inner game. First, they build their deck to minimize the impact of a lousy draw. Second, they play with calm discipline, even when things aren't going their way. Again, the focus is not on the almighty win, but on being wholly present in the game. The distinction might be a fine one, but I believe it holds nonetheless. One of the greatest players I know is Sean Fleischman of Brooklyn, New York. He finished in the top 16 at Pro Tour New York, was second at Pro Tour Columbus, and is considered by many to be a brilliant deck designer. He was one of the first players in New York to use the Balance deck. Balance is a card that has a symmetrical effect technically, but you can kind of break the symmetry by putting cards into play like artifacts that kind of aren't affected by the symmetry of balance, or by doing things like to reduce your land count or reduce your hand size or things like that. But a Balance deck is a deck built around the card Balance. I've never beaten Sean, but I've played him using decks that are theoretically his bane. Once, after beating me in the finals of a local tournament, he advised me to never stop thinking about the game while sitting across from an opponent. It seems like obvious advice, but many times I've caught myself drifting off while waiting for my opponent to do something. For example, I might zone out while my opponent uses Thawing Glaciers during upkeep. Again, this is the card that lets you get extra lands into play, search for a basic land, put it in the battlefield, and then you put the Thawing Glaciers back into your hand at the next cleanup step. So it's like a weird kind of phrase card, but if they're using that card, you can kind of zone out, rather than actively study the game even when things are slow. It takes discipline to remain committed when little is happening. But remember, some decks and strategies appear to do nothing while steadily plotting your demise. Playing means more than just drawing, laying a land, or casting whatever's available. It means more than simply following a routine that has proven successful in most situations. The great players approach each decision carefully, reflecting on what each action or non-action will mean to the game as a whole. It takes discipline to develop your strategic sense to the point where you're able to consider the repercussions flowing from what card you play and when you play it. It is discipline that separates the great players from the good players in any game or endeavor. For example, how many of us actually look at what land our opponents play? We think we know what the opponent is playing by the third or fourth turn and stop paying attention. Having seen forests and mountains for 5 turns, we don't care whether he lays a forest or a mountain on the 6th turn. By this time, we know that it's a red-green deck and we tune it out. And yet, if a red-green player lays out a mountain on the 6th turn, it could mean he or she is building mana for an X spell of some kind, or holding a huge creature like an Autumn Willow. So back then, a huge creature could be counted as a 6-mana 4/4 that can't be the target of spells or effects, which would later be renamed as Shroud, because it can't be targeted by your spells or effects either, so it's unlike hexproof in that way. And then it also says target player may target Autumn Willow with spells or effects until end of turn, so it kind of removes the Shroud. But 6 mana 4/4 counted as a huge creature back then because this is 1997 Magic we're talking about. If your opponent tapped the rest of the land, he or she may either have a Lightning Bolt, which is the classic 1 mana deal 3 to any target, for whatever, just the contrast between the creatures you're playing, like 6 mana 4/4s, and the spells is like a staple of early Magic. So like Lightning Bolt is like a spell that was still good today, and Autumn Willow is a card that like you can't even imagine getting printed today. If your opponent tapped the rest of the land, he or she may either have a Lightning Bolt for whatever creature you just played, or want you to suspect a bolt. If you are attuned to the game, you could probably safely assume that your opponent doesn't have a Land's Edge because he or she isn't holding on to extra land. And Land's Edge is a card that lets you discard a card from your hand at any time, and if you discard a land, you deal 2 damage to target player. So you can basically like discard your lands to deal damage. So if they're playing their extra lands, they don't have Land's Edge. Looking carefully at what mana your opponent taps and in what order may reveal the presence of other cards. During one tense game against a red-blue deck, and also back then, this is before they called red-blue decks like Is It decks or things like that, because Ravnica hadn't come out, so they didn't call them things like that. I noticed that my opponent first tapped 1 island, then touched his second island, reconsidered, and tapped 2 mountains to cast a Frenetic Efreet. Even though he left 2 blue open, an important rule for any permission player, permission is another name for counter magic, I assumed that he had no counter spells in hand, but counter spell is just the blue to counter target spell, since his first instinct was to use the second island. I won that game because I was able to cast Armageddon on my turn without fearing a counter spell. Armageddon, again, destroys all lands. Watching the way a player holds his or her cards and rearranges them might also reveal a thing or two, especially if you took notice of where that bolt came from last round, so like which part of their hand, and where the drawn card is placed. That's why like a lot of professional players will shuffle their hand a little bit during play so people can't track this stuff. Some might say playing in this way is cheesy, but actually this is nothing short of good strategy. No one forced your opponent to line up all of their direct damage together after all, because some players might put all their bolts on one side of their hand just so they can like keep track easily. But again, that's not necessarily a good thing to do if your opponent is paying attention. The key in all of this is an active intelligence. Great players are always playing, even if they do nothing but play lands and end their turn. They are always looking, always analyzing, and always thinking of possibilities and probabilities. Total faith. Magic is a game of chance. Bad draws happen. I have lost more matches to strange, nay, supernatural draws than to any other single cause. I could have 30 land and access to alternative mana, so something like a mana rock or an artifact that makes mana, and I'll draw a Mishra's Factory and nothing else for 7 turns. Mishra's Factory is a colorless land that can become a creature. And for 7 turns, and die to a Matenda Lion, which is a 2/1, but it can be kind of thwarted if you have access to blue mana to make it not deal combat damage. Despite having 14 sources of blue in the deck, bad things just happen. One difference between great players and others is total faith in their ability to win. Great players have hope in the most hopeless situations. They believe in both their skill and their deck in order to deal with whatever situation confronts them. Great players play with absolute confidence. I distinctly remember playing Mark Chalice at the first professional tournament. And this isn't the first professional tournament that the author played in. This is the first professional Magic tournament ever, because this is an old article and it's pretty wild. But yeah, after the first day, he hadn't done as well as he had hoped with his Necro deck, which is a deck built around Necropotence, which is a super powerful black enchantment that kind of defined a lot of early competitive Magic play. There was an entire summer referred to as Black Summer because Necropotence was so dominant, and it's just a really, really powerful card advantage tool. But a deck built around that would be referred to as a Necro deck. So his spirits were low. I was playing a blue-white deck with 4 copies of Land Tax, a card that had proved to be his bane during the tournament, and Land Tax is an enchantment that lets you get extra lands out of your deck. I somehow managed to play 3 Land Tax cards in a row. He commented dryly, "Land Tax, I always lose because of that card." He then proceeded to beat me into oblivion with Hordes of Black Knight and Hypnotic Spectre, which were great creatures for the day, especially Hypnotic Spectre because it gets you card advantage and it's a flyer, and it's like a relatively sizable body as a 3-mana 2/2 flyer, especially for back then. And killed me with a Drain Life, which is an early direct damage spell in black. Did I get a poor draw? Probably, but what most impressed me about that game was how unflappable Chalice remained. I can think of countless other examples. Stephen O'Mahony Schwartz facing down a horde of Urnem Djinns and Spectral Bears, which are some of the most giant creatures you could have back then. 4 mana 4/5, even though it gives your opponent's creature pseudo unblockable with Forest Walk and or one of their creatures. And Spectral Bears 2 mana 3/3, but it can't untap if they don't have a black permanent. So like some giant things in play against a single Black Knight holding 5 lands in his hand and nothing else. His opponent, fazed by the total faith in Steve's demeanor, made playing errors until Steve drew Zurin Orb, which is like a way to gain life attached to a cheap artifact, followed by Nevoniral's Disc, a board wipe, which is absolutely key to coming back from facing down a horde of creatures, then Necropotence, which we already mentioned, Ivory Tower, and finally Drain Life for the kill. Again, the amazing thing for me is that Steve maintained the same look of steely determination whether he drew a swamp or Zurin Orb, so whether a land or a spell. Great players also seem to play with an almost superhuman positive attitude. I'm thinking specifically of Hammer's performance last year in the second professional tournament. Again, the second professional tournament, but other examples are easy to find. And Hammer is referring to a player called Sean Renier, who was referred to as the Hammer and won the second Pro Tour of all time, which was a limited Pro Tour, so he gets a special little legend status on this channel where we usually focus on limited, but he won the second Pro Tour ever, and was known for, I guess, of course, having a superhuman positive attitude. Also known for having like giant muscles and stuff like that, which is kind of a cool, like just being called the Hammer is generally pretty cool. Or just Hammer, not even the Hammer, just Hammer. They rarely curse, rarely have fits, generally do not behave rudely, and so forth. If they're mana hosed, they look and play as if they meant to draw just one land. In more instances than I can remember, great players overcome whatever initial difficulty they face and win the game. If they lose the first game, they play as if they have the next 2 games in the bag, because Magic is best of 3, of course. They play this way even if they got crushed, humiliated, and embarrassed in the first game. Their opponents, on the other hand, tend to get overconfident, excited, and perhaps as a result do not play as carefully as they need to and lose. Healthy perspective. At the end of the day, those players who are truly great seem to understand that Magic is just a game and that a tournament, even the Pro Tour, is just one event. If they lose a game, they focus on the next 2 games. If they lose a match, they focus on the next match. If they lose enough matches to drop them out of contention, they focus on the next tournament. If they lose 3 tournaments in a row, they expect to win the next one. If nothing goes right, they just step back and stay positive because it's just a game after all. If you lose control of the inner game of Magic, then you lose the mental toughness that it takes to overcome all obstacles. You cannot win except through good luck. Great players not only build decks that minimize the effect of luck on the outcome of the match, but less obviously, their attitude neutralizes the debilitating effects of chance on their concentration. One of my recent tournament experiences illustrates how the inner game of Magic works. I played in a large standard tournament using pre-1997 restrictions with a deck I had tuned and retuned to perfection. I knew the deck inside out and had used it to beat a wide variety of opponents. In one match, I lost the first game because my opponent played a third turn Yellow Door and Outpost, which is a land that lets you produce soldier tokens. And when I tried to cast Armageddon, my opponent happened to have Arcane Denial in hand. So when they tried to destroy all lands, the opponent had a counter spell. Looking back, I knew that my deck was easily the best suited to deal with my opponent's deck, as it contained Armageddon, so a land destruction spell, Winter Orb, a artifact that makes it hard to untap lands, Mudslide, which is a card that makes it so that creatures don't untap during their untap phase, unless they're like paying additional mana, which is hard to do if you're trying to win with a bunch of 1/1s, Wrath of God, which is a board wipe, Pyroclasm, which is a board wipe, Counter Magic, Swords to Plowshares, like the best removal spell ever printed, Lightning Bolt, again, a great removal spell, Circle of Protection Red, which is great against red decks, of course, and Mystical Tutor and Enlightened Tutor, so go like some tutors to go fetch up the key cards that might be needed. But I was shaken by the loss. I lost faith in myself and in my deck and did not regain it even after I crushed him in the second game. In the third game, I played tentatively, nervously, forgetting one thing after another until I found myself at 4 life. Only then did I notice that my opponent had been attacking me with an ever-increasing horde of outpost tokens, even though I'd had a Mudslide in play for the last 10 turns. So Mudslide, of course, as we already mentioned, is the card that makes it so creatures without flying don't untap. So basically, he forgot that he had the card in play that would have stopped those 1/1s from absolutely wrecking him. I lost that game and the match because of a stupid playing error. How did it happen? You could say I was careless, stupid, whatever, but what really happened was that I had allowed myself to lose the inner game of Magic. I did not believe that I could win, so I found a way to lose. Having lost the inner game, I could not win the outer game. I pulled myself together after that match, put it out of my mind, and tried to regain my composure. I won 4 straight after that, defeating decks that could have beaten mine simply because I refused to lose the inner game. No matter how bad things appeared, I told myself to have faith, to play with active intelligence, and to keep things in perspective. Think back to a loss that you later realized you should have won. How strong was your inner game during that match? And think back to those games you won, even though logic suggested you should have lost. How strong was your inner game then? And more importantly, do you face up to loss and victory with the same graceful strength? This is character, and this is the pinnacle of the inner game of Magic. To attain that level of strength in life, I believe, is an excellent reason to play Magic in the first place. So, 1997 classic, The Inner Game of Magic. If you made it to the end, leave hashtag inner game in the comments section down below. I really do hope you enjoyed this. I think it is incredibly relevant today and remains relevant, even though Magic has changed a lot since the days where we were playing 6-mana 4/4s and things like that. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.